this was a special request from someone wanting to know how to sew, or seam rather, a vertical seam with garter stitch. And it brings up a good point. In the next few weeks I'll probably doing some other videos on different types of stitch patterns. And anyway, these are the homework swatches for the finishing class that I'm doing. And we're not actually seaming these two together in this way, but it is kind of interesting that the student that gets this is going to have some red schmutz in there. Now you've got two choices when you're seaming on the side that you seam together. In this piece, when you seam garter stitch, or rather when you bind off for garter stitch, the side that you bind off knitwise is going to look like this. The side that you bind off the wrong side, or purlwise, is going to look like this. And I've discovered through experimentation it's much better to seam from this side than from this side. And in the blog at arendaholiday.com you can see photos of why I think this is preferable. I'm not going to demonstrate it. Now, the rule for seaming the bound off edge, or the horizontal piece, is exactly the same. It will always be the same for whatever stitch pattern you're using. And that is the center of the stitch below. And so here's my stitch below, stitch below, stitch below, stitch below. And again, I'm choosing this piece, side of the piece, because it's going to look better. And in the blog I give some advice on, how to make sure that that's the right side of the piece when you're doing it. Now, with garter stitch is kind of an odd duck because it takes 2 rows to make a ridge. And typically what you do when you're seaming a selvage edge is that you are using a ratio that is 3 rows for, and then skip a 4th, and that's going to have the fabric lie flat. But in garter stitch, if you have a tension in your garter stitch that looks like this, where it's fairly tight, you can actually do each ridge to every stitch, and it lines up pretty well. Now, if your garter stitch tension looks like this, then you're going to have to adjust that and probably use more of a standard selvage type pickup ratio like you would for stockinette stitch. But when it's tight like this works just fine. So I'm going to go into the center of the stitch below the bind off edge. There's my bind off edge, and it's purlwise, and notice it looks like knit stitches. On the other side I would be going in right under the bind off edge, and it would be right above the purl bumps, the little bumpy part. And as I said before, I've just discovered it looks better if you're not doing that. If I'm going in here, if that's the row below the bind off edge, it's just not going to look as good. So I'm going to go in here, and I'm going to insert my needle immediately under the purl bump, or the ridge, okay, the first ridge, and the purl bump of the first ridge, and up to the same location on the next one. So I'm kind of skipping over the bump and that row. I'm going to go in where I came out and into the next center of the next stitch, and I'm going to go in where I came out, and I'm going to come up under, right on top, so that I'm right where that next little bump is. Enter, in and out, same spot, skip. Actually, what I'm doing is I'm skipping 2 rows there. And I'm just going to continue along doing that. And I'm almost done. And here we go, and then I'll pull it tight. Okay, so this is how it looks. And when I pull it tight, you can see that that looks pretty good. I haven't, this side of the piece, the vertical side looks pretty even, not distorted. This side looks pretty even and not distorted. And that's what we're looking for here. You can see in the blog entry that if you do it the other way around, if I were to go in right above these pearl bumps, you're not going to get this clean of a line. It's going to look kind of bumpy, and unfortunately you have to kind of think about that when you're knitting the piece, when you're binding off. So there we have it, garter stitch.